Well, welcome into the Backroads Bill podcast. I'm Ben, and today we have a absolute doozy of a podcast. Normally when we talk to guests, we usually last about 30 minutes to 45 minutes, somewhere in that range. But when we sat down with today's guest, Cory Dingle, who is the executive director of the Norval Morrisseau Estate, our conversation lasted an hour and 45 minutes. It was an absolutely amazing conversation, and it deserved to go that long. And that's why this particular episode is split up into two parts. So if you're listening to this podcast the week it releases, part 2 will be out next Wednesday. And you will want to make sure you listen to that, because for those who don't know, Norval Morrisseau was a famous Indigenous painter whose works have been popular overseas, especially in Europe. And one of the big controversies that's been happening actually for decades is the fight against these fake paintings of his that have come up. And this podcast is kind of twofold. We're going to be talking about Norval and his struggles through racism and homophobia back in the 50s and 60s and later on in his life. But also the fight that the estate has had against the Canadian legislation around asset defamation. And if you don't know what asset defamation is, you're about to learn, because it is a very, let's say, interesting law. And it's the reason why they can't get these fakes off the market. And they can't even tell someone, if they know that is a fake painting, they can't even tell them that it's a fake without being sued. Including museums, by the way. It's something. They also have a really cool AI program that the estate has developed to spot fake paintings. That's going to be a little bit more in part 2. But there is a lot to get into in this podcast. And this is just part 1. So you'll want to make sure, again, you come back for part 2 next week. So we're going to get right into it. But first, a word from today's sponsor.
Hi, I'm Natasha Laframboise, sales representative with the Laframboise team at Realty Executives Local Group Inc. Brokerage. We are a local real estate team here in North Bay. Our team of sales representatives, Matt Laframboise, Phil Seguin, and Adam Legros, are ready to help you through the buying and selling experience. We have been providing service to the North Bay and area community for over 17 years. Our goal is to provide knowledge, support, and guidance in order to prepare your home for sale, bring it to market using multiple selling strategies, and get it sold. As a home buyer, we have 2 buyer's agents ready to help you find your home sweet home. If you'd like to know more, check us out on our website, laframboiseteam.ca. We are always happy to help.
Well, we've talked about Norval Morrisseau before on this show, and one of the ongoing issues that was happening were there were these fakes that were circulating around. And last week, actually, when we were recording for the resource siding tragedy, it was Bill. You came in a little bit early, and you sat in the studio, and you had this sentencing hearing going on in your phone. And so after we did that, you said we have to reach out to today's guest that we brought on today, because this is something very close to your heart and very close to the history of Northern Ontario. And so as I was reading up on this, one of the excerpts that I took, it was from the artnewspaper.com about the sentencing. It said, on Thursday, the 5th of September, David Voss, described by Crown prosecutors as the, quote, principal architect behind a major forgery scheme, peddled thousands of fake Norval Morrisseau paintings and was sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud. So today we are delighted to be joined by Cory Dingle, who is the executive director of Norval Morrisseau Estate. Cory, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, gentlemen. It's an honor and privilege to be here.
Well, Cory, thank you for being here, because, Ben, it is a Northern Ontario story. We'll get to that, but it's a Canadian story. It's an international story, and it's a story that's not over yet. It has a beginning. I don't even know if we're in the middle, and I don't know if it'll ever end, Cory. And we'll get to all these things in the Backroads Bill podcast. And I say Northern Ontario because Norval Morrisseau spent a good portion of his adult life in Northern Ontario, and Cory will explain that. And Cory, again, I'm so glad that you're here today. But for people that may not know anything about Norval, we're going to ask you, and I know you're a great storyteller because and this is another thing, Ben, that Cory had personal attachment to Norval at a certain time of his life, and we'll get to that as well. But tell us a little bit about Norval Morrisseau, and there have been books and documentaries, and it's not a fair question, but I think I do encounter people that don't know about Norval Morrisseau, believe it or not.
Well, Morrisseau, I think we try to encapsulate 60 years of legacy in that sense. And I started with Norval in 1989, lived with them for about 10 years, and then have proceeded to, play different roles in this, what we call a universal weave. We always knew that where we were in the timeline of humanity, that the universe had a specific purpose. And Norval would used to always say that it was just my name, it was just my hand that was creating this. But at the end of the day, what we are involved in this universal weave is a larger plan that for humanity, that we need to learn these lessons and to survive and to be better. And how do I encapsulate Norval? Now, Norval is considered Canada's greatest artist ever produced, and he is considered probably the greatest Indigenous artist. In certainly in my bias, I ascribe to that. When we look at Canada as a whole on the universal spectrum of nations, and we think about our moral and ethical code and our culture and history, and Canada on the world stage is looked favorably to for our moral and ethical codes, and the progress that we've made as a Canadian. You don't have to look too far to see other countries that still struggle with um, acknowledging Indigenous rights, acknowledging LGBTQ rights, women's rights, environmental thoughts. A lot of these moral conundrums that they battle with, we have already moved on in society with. And Morrisseau's significance to Canada is that he forced us through his art and his trials and tribulations and his spirit to face these issues. Now, Morrisseau, of course, we all know, was this transitional figure between two histories in the sense. We have the old world where Morrisseau did live in the bush. He was a parent with his grandfather on their trap line, but then being ripped out of that bush at 8 years old and stuffed into a residential school program where he did suffer sexual and physical abuses, and so we have Morrisseau really with his two hands between the two different worlds, the new world and the old world. And we have a number of paintings where you will see, such as Androgyny, Canada's probably greatest work of art, that has sat in Rideau Hall, and of course, famously Harper especially would love to take his cabinetry position, his year-end picture with all his cabinet in front of it, which was such a wonderful thing because that painting had such deep lessons that I think every political organization should go and sit in front of it and learn its lessons from it. But in the middle of that painting, you see a giant thunderbird, and it is a common theme that we were aware that Morrisseau bridged these two worlds and these two societies, and so he was this conduit. And so, we go back where he's 10 years old and he has to, he escapes from the residential school program and has to run 150 miles back to his people. And then he his reserve of Sand Point gets displaced by the Ontario government, and their homes flooded and burned and bulldozed to make a park, which who we work very closely with, and to their credit, through 50 years of litigation, has finally gotten their lands back, and that reconciliation and healing begins. And then you get into, early examples of Norval, in Northern Ontario, where there were such racist rules and laws that the Indigenous people couldn't even go into the town. And Norval would talk about, those early origins of trying to learn who these people were that were in his land now. And he was restricted to, just a few areas that he could attend, which was the church. He could go to the mill and work. He could go to the trading store, and he could go to the garbage dump. But that was it. And so when we reflect on Norval's art, which we may do later in this thing, we see how he came up with his art in that sense, and we can talk about that. But here we are now in the late 50s, and Morrisseau is fully impoverished. He's working at the mill, and a couple from Europe, Dr. Weinstein and his wife, come up to Northern Ontario to learn the culture and history. And these people are European kind of socialite. They have a very good connection to the world. And serendipitously, through chance, they see two Norval Morrisseau paintings and immediately recognize what they're looking at, and start sending pictures of those paintings back to their friends Picasso and Marc Chagall back in Europe, and the international community starts recognizing the greatness, and Picasso states that to Weinstein, see, you can find a master anywhere. Picasso had this philosophical sense that you don't need to go through schools, you don't need to go through these certain programs, that on this earth there are people who try to do art, which is wonderful. There's people who do art, and that is beautiful. But then there is a select rare entities that the universe gives us to give us art. And these are what are called natural born artists. And you have to find and nurture these natural born artists, because really what these natural born artists are here to do is to not only inspire and educate, and to be creative, but they're conduits from the Great Spirit, to help progress humanity forward. And so Picasso had this feeling, and he recognized that in Morrisseau. And so you then elevate to the early 60s, where Jack Pollock goes up, introduces himself to Norval, and decides to do the very first show of an Indigenous artist in a major gallery known in the world. And that was a groundbreaking event. And so when I try to encapsulate the importance of Morrisseau, it's contained in the picture that we have. And it's at Norval's first show, and he's standing with his back to one of his pieces of art. And he's a young man, and he's steel spined, and he's looking at the camera with this burning intensity. And there's this little English lady standing beside him, just this tiny little lady, and she's got a cigarette, in the gallery, and then she's got her cup of tea, right? And she's looking up at Norval, and she's like, "Who the hell are you?" Right? Like, you could just see her mind is just, it's grappling. It's grappling with the fact that you are labeled a bush Indian, which is supposed to represent a lesser being to me, to this British lady, to the Gentile. And Picasso's calling you a master. And here I am at your show in Toronto, and you've just sold all your works in one night. And you could just see her mind having to grapple with this new reality that this man who has no formal education, you know, went, as Norval said, they put me in kindergarten, I failed, I did kindergarten again, I did grade 1, I failed grade 1, I did grade 1 again, and then that was it, I ran away, right? And so here we are with this lady, stunned, and that started reverberating around the world. And at the end of it, when we're dealing with all this systemic racism and we're facing this being that's supposed to be my inferior, but again, Picasso just called you the Picasso of the North, and this is crazy. And then he says to them, "Oh, and by the way, I'm bisexual." And it's like, imagine yourself as Norval in that moment in 1961, 62, in that environment where the South is still raging with civil rights, and we're dealing with all that systemic racism, and the shoulders that you must have had to be able to stand steel spined and say, "Deal with me right now, Canada, right? Deal with your racism views and deal with your homophobia at the same time." And so that was an internal conversation that Canada had to happen. But then a byproduct of that event, which was more profound for Canada as well, was that he gathered international fame from that.
That little old lady either spilled her tea or choked on it at that time, because I mean, a statement like that, of course, is, I'm going to say, way ahead of its time. And of course, I think he was way ahead of his time, and we've all just caught up, as time goes on. So, and I didn't mean to cut you off, and the viewers and the listeners will know that I've done a couple stories with Cory, and of course my CBC things and those kinds of things, and I've encouraged Cory to write a book, because we're getting this it's a real pleasure to hear these stories, because a lot of these things have been written down, but in this particular case you're talking to someone that knows Norval, and I think that's so important to our conversation today. I want to take you back from where you kind of left off. Norval led a troubled life, and you can talk a bit about that, because he had difficulties bridging that old world to the new world, and you maybe talk a bit about that. And then that's not what this is about, because we're going to celebrate Norval, but at the same time, people have to understand, because it kind of leads eventually into the forgeries, in a sense.
Mm-hmm. I think on the last part of the significant side of things is, Norval is very popular in France. Norval is very popular in Germany, in Italy. And so from that event, Norval starts going around the world. And really a significant thing that happened was that the international community started looking at Canada and saying, "How are you treating this Indigenous man? How are you treating this Indigenous people?" And all of a sudden, the bubble that was contained in our little country of Canada, without the internet, without the social media, and without that stuff, he was the spark of that fire that set off international condemnation to Canada about how we were treating the Indigenous people. And so his vision that he had, and we can certainly talk about that story, about how to preserve his culture and his history, came to him in a vision while he lay dying of tuberculosis and pneumonia. And this vision that he had to write down, to preserve, to paint the oral traditions, he received a lot of flack from. He was ostracized from his community at that time, because that was taboo at this moment. But he knew that he had to do that to not only educate the European nation that was coming in, but to also to preserve. And so, I always say it, this podcast today is an actualization of that initial universal weave that started so many decades ago. And here we are talking to an audience, your audience, about his culture, and we are advancing Canada's moral and ethical code.
Again, way ahead of truth and reconciliation, and I guess as opposed the arts community and art as opposed to sports or politics, some things get pushed off to the side, and I'd like you to talk a little bit about. He was ahead of his time. He was trying to get. We also have to remember he was a writer too, and this was captured real well. But and he continued to do this to talk about culture, and as you said, it was taboo. And so how did he fare that way? Because there must have been an incredible amount of pressure on him to do this, but he did it anyway for decades.
Yeah, and he did it. He did it consistently with love, right? And for the goodwill. And so we always kind of mention a video speech that he made, and he's standing in front of androgyny. And you can imagine the timeline, okay? Being an impoverished, ripped out of the bush, Sandpoint, dealing with the racism, the prejudice, dealing with the constant drunk Indian narrative in the media at that time, all these things that would have dragged down a soul into bitterness, into anger. He refused. And where he even donate to the people of Canada, not the government. The government is holding androgyny, Canada's greatest artwork, for the people of Canada. He didn't give it to the Canadian government. They're holding it. But he gave it to the people of Canada to say, I believe in your spirit and we will not give up on you. Right. And that is such a beautiful message, because after all the trials and tribulations, as I said, that would have dragged somebody down. And he even says it in the speech, right? You sent your missionaries to destroy my soul, right? You sent the governments to objugate me. You sent your media to diminish me, but I will not accept that, because I believe in the Canadian spirit and the Canadian people. And therefore I give you androgyny. And we still live on that time. And later, when we segue into the fraud market, that's what we're still doing with the frauds. And we'll talk about it, but when we deal with our lawyer firms, the easiest thing for me to do as the executive director, to clean up our fates, to get rights, and to really eliminate probably 80% of the frustrations that we have at the estate, financially, time-wise, is to leave Canada, is to move to Germany, to register our corporation in Germany and be under German law. And we'll get into it, but Canada is a young country, and we have not had the opportunities to deal with these issues, such as the largest art fraud case in global history, the largest cultural appropriation event in global history, where European nations have had dealt with fine art for thousands of years. They've had these opportunities to enact proper criminal code, civil code, Copyright Act, changes in their policies to reflect. Canada is a young country. We haven't had the opportunity. And so we are hundreds of years behind these other nations in our protections of art and artists. And so this is Canada's moment right now. Government, media, all the people that are listening, this is the moment. If we cannot do this now for Canada, Canadian artists, and all the things that we'll talk about at this moment, whenever will we do it, right? There is no bigger.
Yeah, and we didn't do it. It didn't happen with the group of 7, did it?
No.
So, and I want you to comment on that, because it's almost like, why did they pick an Indigenous person? But I think it's more that in a contemporary sense, he was the person of the time, and his works of art were so well thought of, again, internationally. So tell us a little bit about that. Like, why did the forgeries, and maybe we're a little ahead of ourselves, but tell us a little bit why did they pick on him?
I always like to drag this back, that this is not a Norval issue, and it's not an Indigenous issue. This is a Canadian issue, right? And I will reference another artist who I absolutely love, in Maud Lewis. I love Maud Lewis. She brings a tear to my eye. Um, and we see some similarities in the fact that Maud Lewis and Norval Morrisseau have a somewhat primitive style, right? In their paintings. So, are they easier to forge? Probably, right? Canada, I will mention, is extremely lucky, because in this positive moment that we're in of learning, that we're going to learn from this, we are so lucky that the frauds are so terrible. They are so terrible. These are not masterworks of forgery that requires XRF and infrared spectrometry and all this high level stuff. They are so poorly executed because the fraudsters thought, after 27 years 27 years of us knowing, of us alerting, of us crying, of us battling, that they had impunity, that they could just get away with it. So I'm not going to try anymore, right? And so we're so lucky that the mess that we have to clean up is so obvious, right? I would shudder to think, if it was an actual professional fraud ring, that had some skill in it. So again, Canadian issue. We know that there's probably 1,500 fake Maud Lewis paintings on the market, and they come from Hungary or Bulgaria, we suspect, right? So what does that say about Canada and its laws, that other parts of the world know that we are a Wild West dumping ground of fraudulent painting, and that they can come and attack our culture and our heritage? And they don't care if they get $3,000 for a fake painting. They don't care if they get, whatever happens. They know that they can operate with impunity in our system. And so really, when we talk about the fraud, you somewhat have this, in a cheeky way, I refer to this pyramid of pain that we go through. And at the bottom of our experience, at the bottom of Norval's experience, is Norval Morrisseau, is is his legacy, is the fact that that it made us poor, like dirt poor, because we couldn't make any money. And so we, his effort, his works, the fact that he was suffering with Parkinson's disease, and the last 11 years of his life, we couldn't have him as most comfortable, because we were poor, and we were battling in this art fraud, and the government and the agencies were ignoring that. And so Norval's at the bottom. Next up on that list is his culture, the cultural appropriation, the bastardization of the legends and of the iconography. Above that is all Canadian artists, right? Because if I can go and get a Morrisseau, Canada's greatest artist, and I can get him for pennies on the dollar, then what's the second, third, fourth, or 500th artist going to get? Zero. Oh, I can go and get a Morrisseau for 10 grand. You want 10 grand? You're not Morrisseau. Well, it took me 3 months to paint. Oh, I'm sorry. Go get a job. Like, you know what I mean? Not my problem, right? So, but and as well as, if it takes a rock star after 23 years of battling to make a documentary that goes around the world to get justice, what is the second, third, or fourth 500th artist going to get in justice, right? And so this negatively affects all Canadian artists, their pricing, their rights, their hopes, their dreams. But at the very tip of the pyramid is the world citizen in that sense, because as mentioned, Canada is a world leader on the moral and ethical stage. What Canada does people look at. When there's a major war, what is Canada doing? They look at us for some guidance in that moral and ethical code. We are a mosaic of beautiful people that look at everybody in an energetic way. We have our issues, of course, but we have such less racism, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, all the things that I mentioned. From that, we've learned from Morrisseau, where you make the cheeky announcement that looking at our brothers in the South, some of these issues, we are 60, 70 years ahead of them. And so when my international colleagues around the world say, Cory, like, we'd love to show Canadian art, but we will not buy Canadian art. We will not show Canadian art. We will not promote Canadian art, because you can't even tell me if this is a real painting or not, because you'll get sued for asset defamation. And we have no faith in your checks and balances of your criminal code, civil code, Copyright Act. So why would we risk our reputation as a museum or something to display your art, buy your art, do all these things? And then therefore, what happens is that we as a Canadian can't show our culture, our heritage, our moral and ethical code on the world stage, so people around the world can learn and advance.
Well, we're going to get right back to Cory and this really fascinating story. But first, we do have to thank our one of today's sponsors, Twigs. And North Bay Echo is proud to partner with Twigs Coffee Roasters, a part of the community since 1995. Bill, it's one of your favorite places. How long have you been going there?
Yeah, no, there are Twigs locations in various communities, and I've been going there for a long, long time because, of course, on my phone I have, is it Twigs McEwen or Twigs Downtown? And I even know when I go through the drive-thru, one of my favorites is the Montreal smoked meat on rye, and, of course, the salmon on a bagel along with the coffee and everything else. So I'm a great believer in supporting local retail and franchises, and so I'm so glad that we've got Twigs on the Backroads Bill podcast.
Yeah, Twigs offers a wide selection of quality beans, fresh roasted in-house every day. You can find your favorite specialty drink at our espresso bar, rejuvenate with freshly squeezed juice, or treat yourself to mouth-watering selections from our gourmet deli. What is your go-to drink, Bill?
Well, I kind of like the dark roast, but I was saying and ask for a scone to go with whatever the beverage is, to be sure.
I do have a good scone one here. Don't forget our irresistible fresh-baked goods, including uncompromising gluten-free options. Quickly about the scones. The raspberry ones are to die for. In the office, we have these things called scone bets. You make a bet. If you lose, the loser has to go and get scones. It's fantastic.
Your best bet is to go through the Twigs drive-thru or go into the restaurant
right down the street.
and have a seat.
Yep. So Twigs does have 5 locations, 2 of them here in North Bay, to serve you from North Bay to Sturgeon Falls to Sudbury. You can order online for pickup at twigs.ca. And coming soon, Bill, just for you, you'll be able to order fresh roasted coffee beans direct to your doorstep from our distribution center in North Bay.
Wow. Well, I'm glad we've got this on the Backroads Bill podcast.
So let's get right back into Cory, because I know he's got a lot more stuff to say. So let's get back to it. One of the things I thought, Cory, you said that was really interesting was when you said, hey, we should just go to Germany, basically, and take the corporation to Germany because of the lack of certain Canadian laws. And then you just talked about a lot of them. What I really wanted to know, though, is what needs to change in Canada? Like, what are the laws specifically that's prohibiting you? And like, what do you think makes Canada such a bad place, as you were just saying, for all these artists?
That's going to be a whole other program and podcast, I think.
Maybe a bit of a.
But Cory will answer that question, because Norval, I don't want to say he's the example, but he is the example because of what happened over with the fraud. So he is the example because in what I understand, there is no protection.
And great question. So here we go. Now, again, we learned from Morrisseau. We learned about residential schools. We learned about land appropriation. We learned about cultural appropriation. We learned about negative narratives in the media. And Norval endured all that. He still loved Canada. Here's androgyny. We believe in you. And so once again, we are learning from Morrisseau because of this event of his trials and tribulation. It's the same weave that's been woven for decades. And here we are. And you're absolutely right, Bill. We are the example, even though Maud Lewis, the Group of Seven, all these things, but they don't have the significance of Morrisseau on the world stage. And of course, when you allow it to go on for 27 years and we get up to horrific numbers, where we were crying after 40 paintings found, we were crying after 400, right? And now we're up to 5,000-6,000 paintings. And so when you tie the narrative of the largest cultural appropriation event in modern history with the largest art fraud case in global history, and sadly, one of those fraud ringleaders was a convicted serial sex offender against Indigenous teens, you do not get a worse narrative in this stuff. So we have to flip it and get onto the positive of how we learn from Morrisseau, again, for the betterment of Canada. Now, you're absolutely right when I mention Germany, and it's shocking when I speak to certain levels of the government, and I'm like, well, many corporations leave Canada to get away from your taxation or your environmental laws or what have you, right? Very sad that we have to leave to get some, get some protection, right? So the script is flipped on that. But let's start the journey here of some of the things that need to be changed. And I want to also shout out, we have assembled probably the greatest legal team now that Canada has ever seen, point blank. We have engaged, and these people are coming at us pro bono. This is free work, right? We have engaged probably the most prestigious art law firm in the world out of the UK called Mishcon de Rea, right? Simon, Aaron Taylor, Lavinia, Apollonia, these individuals that are at the top of their field have come on and said, we need to help you with this. Breskin and Parr, Canada's #1 IP lawyer firm in Canada, has come on board. Clark Miller Consultants, past general counsel of EMI out of New York, right? And so we have assembled an international team of lawyers at such a high level to help us with our day-to-day problems of cleaning up this mess, but more importantly, their knowledge of what is working in Germany, what is working in the UK, what is working in Italy, to coagulate those policies that these advanced countries, these older countries have adopted, to wrap that up in a neat ball and present it to the Canadian government. So, Ministry of Heritage, you need to call us. Ministry of Justice, Counselor General, right? We will put together the package. We will do the work for you, right? That what works, sign it into law, make Canada the gold standard of art fraud in the world so we can help advance the world.
So,
okay?
Cory, just super quick, is the problem with the law more to do with trying to convict people of fraud?
No. it's even getting before that in
Oh,
the
wow.
sense. Okay, it's even getting before that. So let's start off with a simple exercise. You come to me and you say, I bought this painting and I would like you to authenticate it for me. Do you think it's real? And then I have to tell you that I cannot in Canada, because if I do, as we have done, and as we have been sued multiple times for asset defamation, okay? That doesn't exist in Germany, doesn't exist in the UK. If you come to me as an expert, as the CEO of the estate of Norval Morrisseau, say, look at this painting, is it real or not? I just paid $50,000 for it, or I'm going to. And if I tell you that it's fake, you can sue me for asset defamation. You simply go and fill out your paperwork at this small claims court and pay your $15 and sue me for asset defamation. Now, the fraudsters they had multiple, I would say, divisions, right? They had their propaganda division that we can talk about. They had their production, they had their money laundering, they had their donation, and one of that division was their legal department. And as soon as anybody, expert witnesses, academics, anybody said, uh, I don't believe this painting is real, they would be sued for asset defamation. And even if they didn't win, but imagine being a volunteer, because when we first found the fake in 1996, and we started alerting the authorities, and they didn't care. They just simply didn't care. It was a white collar crime of some rich white people getting ripped off. Who cares? We got asset allocation that we got to deal with, so on and so forth. They don't see that pyramid of pain. They only see some rich white person got ripped off. They don't see the effect on culture, on everything. And so we were told to go through things in a civil way. One of those methods that we did is that we created the Norval Morrisseau Heritage Society, which was made up of the 12 leading academic and museum curatorial minds that Canada has. And they were tasked with authentication of the painting, building the catalog. And we did this because we were being attacked in a new entity called social media. And we were being attacked that we were producing the fake paintings because we were we were trying to devalue all these other paintings that were real, because it would make our fake paintings more money in this bizarro world of alternate reality of social media. And so we said, okay, we are going to instruct a third party entity, the Norval Morrisseau Heritage Society, at an arm's length, and they are going to be responsible. And these are the world leading minds of Canada on Indigenous art. All of them got sued. As soon as they had an opinion, they got sued. So imagine being a volunteer and an academic, and all of a sudden having to go through 3 to 5 years of court proceedings and spending the money and the online attack, right? So asset defamation is number one. And so what essentially, one of the last court cases, we were in court, and at the end of it, the judge says, did anybody see this painting being fake? And we had to admit, no, even though we had expert witnesses, Carmen Robertson, God bless her soul, expert in Indigenous Morrisseau art. It's fake. She got sued. We had flipped a couple of people in the fraud ring to say, yeah, we were making fakes and this looks like it, and so on and so forth. We even had the receipts from the location where they bought their materials, right? You could look at the painting, you could see brand new staples and brand new frame, and like it was just so obvious it was a fake painting. And the judge says, "Did anyone see this painting being fake?" Well, no, judge. Unfortunately, the fraudster didn't go to the middle of the mall and paint this painting. So no, we can't say. And so he says, in Canada law, therefore, it's 50-50 and 50 coin flip, and it goes to the defendant. Therefore, it's a real Morrisseau painting. Now, hold the fence. In Germany, if you come to me and you say, "Oh, I got a Morrisseau painting," and I say, that's not a Morrisseau, one, you can't sue me for asset defamation. Two, you can't sue expert testimonial witnesses for their opinion in court. Think of the chilling effect that has on our academic and our justice system, that you can do that. And three, you got to prove it to me that it's real. You're claiming that you have a very expensive something. You got to claim that it's real. I can't go and write Ferrari on a Toyota Prius and claim it's a Ferrari. I would have to prove that to you. It would be insane that if you said, "That's not a Toyota, that's just a Toyota," and I sue you, right? So 50-50, it went, it's a real Morrisseau. Now, this is kind of where I get a little bit even cheekier, and I say, Canada doesn't know that I am probably Canada's richest man in the world, because I have such an art collection. And today, for your viewers, I have a very special opportunity. And what it is, and I will sell this at a massive discount. I think this is worth about $1 million. And what this is, it's a real Da Vinci sketch. It's a real Da Vinci sketch. And the academics think that it's Jesus playing hockey. Now, we don't know if he's left or right-handed. We don't know if he's with the Toronto Maple Leafs. I don't know any of that, right? It's Da Vinci. I'm very pronouncing it Da Vinci, and it's Jesus playing hockey. Now, nobody saw me produce this thing. Nobody saw this being made. Therefore, in Canadian law, 50-50, this is a real Da Vinci painting. And because you gentlemen are in the media and you have outreach and your opinion matters, I will remind you before I ask the question, if you say this is not a Da Vinci painting, I will go and fill out paperwork and pay $15 and sue you for asset defamation, and I will drag you through court for 3 to 5 years. So I ask you, gentlemen, is this a real Da Vinci painting?
It must
Would
be.
you like to give your opinion? It must be.
But of course, this is what happened for 27 years over that time period. And of course, we've had one trial and a verdict. And the other day I sat through the sentencing, as we started out by saying, Ben. And correct me though, Cory, I thought it certainly wasn't enough. I thought it was 5 years on the first 2 counts and the other were dismissed. When I read some of the reports after the fact, so maybe I got that wrong. But nonetheless, it was all kind of, well, not enough when we think about everything we've learned today and everything we kind of know about the past. So here we are, and there's going to be one more court case coming up in 2025, I think in February, because there were 3 forgery rings. There may have been more, but and then Cory delivered a victim impact statement to the court. I listened to it. And what did you say the other day that may have been different from the past? Because over your lifetime, having lived with Norval and being the head of the state, you learn as you go, and you have to continue to summarize about, okay, from the beginning, if we look at that pyramid example, where are you at in your thoughts about what's transpired legally, and specifically the court cases and the forgery rings? Because that's the practical side of it. We've talked a lot about the legal and what has to change, and I don't think it's a threat either that the Norval Morrisseau Estate might leave Canada either. I've talked to Cory about this, but what do you think about where we are now, knowing that there is going to be one more case coming up?
Well, we got a couple more cases actually coming up, and then we have the case of forfeiture coming up as well. So legally, we have a number of cans to kick still. I will say, and I wish to express, I remember going into Thunder Bay with Norval, and he said to me, he said, this is the town where old white values need to die and new indigenous behaviors need to die. And Norval saw Thunder Bay as a beacon of hope for society because there's such a strong population between the two cultures. And Thunder Bay has had its challenges, right? And so we're going to be doing a healing ceremony with Thunder Bay between its peoples, because really the Thunder Bay Police Department, that day that they phoned me and said, "We believe you, we want to do something about it," and Detective Ryback, I believed them. I believed them. And I believe that they saw this as a healing moment for them as well, to show the Thunder Bay, the indigenous community, that we are moving forward. So I acknowledge that. They did something that the rest of the world didn't want to look at, didn't want to touch. So kudos to them, and the work of the Crown prosecution in these cases has been remarkable as well. A very important person said to me in she said, "Cory, what we're doing is that we're building a plane as we're flying it." And even if you look at the first case with Gary Lamont, which somewhat baffles me in the conviction of it, he identified 180 paintings of fake paintings. We know he produced thousands more. This You can see the evolution in the plane, in the Crown, because this last conviction, this last plea deal, they made him identify 1,800 works, right? So Canada, we're learning. And so I give kudos to that. When we talk about, and most people signify the 5 years, and you're right, it was concurrent. So he's 5, and then people say, well, Canada, he's going to be out in 2.5, and absolutely, it enrages us, because he will be out long before we have cleaned this up, long before. And as you referenced back to the group of 7 that happened in the 60s, those paintings are still being popped up, and we're still finding them and still being embarrassed about it. And I do raise that point with the Crown, that this is the time to do it, because in 60, 70, 80, 100, 400 years, when Norval still exists and we're all dust, one will pop up and someone will say, why didn't those fools do it then? Right? But I will also have to acknowledge for the Crown and Canadian system that this probably was the longest conviction, longest time for a white collar crime in Canadian history. Now that's sad. That's sad, right? But I do have to acknowledge that it was a record breaker. I also do have to acknowledge that this gentleman spent all his ill-gotten gains on cocaine and hookers, as he claimed, and so he has no money, and he's going to jail. So there's no blood in that stone for us to get any restitution back. And so we champion for a longer sentence, other than some fake or improbable outcome that he's going to pay us back. Now, as I said, now after the court finishes with their cases, with that 1,000 pieces, they've indicated that they don't have the resources to help us anymore after that. It will be punted back to the victims. We are the victims. It'll be punted back to us to help clean up Canada's largest art fraud case, yet missing the tools that we need. There are no victim services fund. There are no grants. There's nothing. There's no structure in the airplane that we're flying to give us those tools. And so, what is really the next step is to shine a light through the media onto the Ministry of Heritage, the Ministry of Justice, the Counselor General, to say we need the policy changes that we will present to you from Mishkan Dereya. Here they are. Do it. And then not only will that eliminate frauds being perpetrated, but give us the tools to do it effectively going forward. Because right now, we're even arguing that half the people want their paintings back, right? Of those 1,000 paintings. So do you think that I want 500 fake paintings going back into the market that someone will just shove in a closet, and then 20 years later, when they're dead, someone will find it in the closet and put it up for sale as the Norval Morrisseau, right? It's insanity. So we have to deal with that forfeiture issue. So how do we get the laws so I can say my opinion, get the piece confiscated, get it off the market, heal the market? Right now, gentlemen, I have about 1,800 requests for verification. 1,800 individual people saying, can you tell me if this is a real Morrisseau or not? Now, I would say out of those 1,800, 100 are prints and about 130 are real. So we're left with, what, 1,550 or something, very individual victims that love Morrisseau. So I love you, right? I love these people. You love us. I love you. And so but I'm handcuffed. I'm absolutely handcuffed in helping them right now. And this is at the individual people level. We can even take it to the institutional level where we have found them in the Ontario legislation in museum. And we have a very large list. The Smithsonian have 4 of them, which is ridiculous. And so we have a very lengthy list of where all these paintings exist that we haven't told anybody. And right now, I have a very well-respected museum that's about to take a very large donation of a significant number of Morrisseau paintings. And they have intaked them. They've taken wonderful pictures of them and all that stuff. And then finally, someone had the idea, well, maybe we should ask if these are real or not. And then, so they reached out to us. We first ran it through our AI program that we're developing that we can talk about. It came out with a result. Through my eye, I conferred with the result. The AI got 2 out of 50 wrong. But through my eye, so I shouldn't say numbers, but there was a very large amount. I just kind of gave you a number, and 2 of them were real, right? 2 were real,
And the rest were fake.
Rest were fake. In my opinion, yada yada yada. And so right now, I have in my hand the reputation of this museum, all their efforts and labor, and a massive embarrassment to them. Or in my other hand, I have the threat of being sued for asset defamation because I'm about to tell a very rich man his collection is worthless, right? And I say to the powers that be, what is the third option here? What is the third option? There is no. And what they tell me is they say, well, for all your personal and institutional, please call the local RCMP dispatchment in that area. And I say, great, right? I will now phone, I'll go and hire a fleet of people, and we will phone 1,600 individual RCMP dispatchments. I'll make 1,600 art fraud investigations, talk to 1,600 detectives, be threatened with 1,600 lawsuits. Madness. When we tracked the fraud sale, we found thousands in Ontario. We found about 1,000 in Alberta. We found 1,000 in BC. We have the court transcripts of the gentleman who used to drive the car from Ontario to BC, selling fake paintings all the way along that he went. We found 3 in Quebec. And you say, 3 in Quebec? You just told me you found 3,000 in Ontario. You telling me that they just can't go east? And to a much larger population than Alberta and British Columbia, and a hell of a lot closer. Why didn't they go over there? Well, Quebec has a provincial art fraud division. Quebec, through its French roots, understand the integrity and the importance of fine art. They have a provincial art fraud division. So when I go to the federal government and I say, do you need a stronger example of proper policy that will do good than that example? 3,000 right here and 3 here. It was clear that the art fraud perpetrators knew.
Yes, they knew.
Stay the hell out of Quebec.
Yeah.
So does that mean in Quebec, Cory, that you can't get sued for asset defamation?
No, you still can under federal, and they'll just sue you in a different jurisdiction.
So that was a lot to take in. And it was really hard to find a good cut point in this conversation, but I highly recommend checking out part 2. If you're listening to this the week of release, it'll be coming out Wednesday, September 25th, very first thing in the morning. And if you're listening to it either on the 25th or after, just go listen to part 2 right now. It's definitely worth it. We get into some crazy stuff with Cory, like more about how asset defamation can and actually is hurting not just the artists' wallets, but also drastically changing their legacy and how you could perceive them as a person. So it's definitely worth checking out. Again, part 2 coming out Wednesday, September 25th. If you want more Backroads Bill podcast, you can of course check us out on all of your favorite podcast platforms. The video version, including seeing Cory's incredibly rare Da Vinci painting that he showed, that's available on the North Bay Echo YouTube channel. Of course, we are always available on NorthBayEcho.ca. And while you're there, you can check out all the other great podcasts we offer, like To North Bay with Love, where yesterday we are actually celebrating the 1-year anniversary of us as a network. So we had Dave and Scott on the show celebrating 1 year of not just To North Bay with Love, but again, the network as a whole. And the same thing with Echo Essentials tomorrow. Scott and Dave had Aaron and Dave Trafford on from Story Studio Network, and they were instrumental in helping launch Echo, and they were a big help when we started this journey to all the members of the team. They were absolutely fantastic. So they're going to be talking a little bit about where we came from and where we are today. It's a great chat as well. That's all available on NorthBayEcho.ca. And that does it for part 1. Join us again next week for part 2.